Hi, I'm Daniel T'seleie. I am K'asho Got'ine Dene from Fort Good Hope. I used to be a lawyer. I don't do that anymore, but I work on self-government negotiations and other rights issues with Indigenous communities.
Hi, my name is Bertha Rabesca-Zoe. I'm K'asho and I live in Betchako, and I'm a lawyer, a sole practitioner, and I do a lot of work for K'asho government in the area of governance, intergovernmental relations, and implementation of land claims and self-government. Masi.
So we're here to talk about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. What is it? Where did it come from? And what does it do? So the background on this declaration, there's a shared history around the world that Indigenous peoples have with colonization, being colonized by other peoples, other governments, and the related impacts of colonization. So things like Indigenous peoples' land being taken away from them and forced relocation off of their lands. So for years, Indigenous peoples around the world have been fighting for their rights, um, and right to protect their land and protect their culture. And governments and countries around the world have continued to deny those rights. So Indigenous peoples have been bringing these concerns to the international level for decades, and including the United Nations. And that's what started this process of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, was peoples from all over the world bringing these issues forward, saying our rights need to be recognized and protected. So writing the declaration was something that took more than 20 years. There was a working group at the United Nations, and it included Indigenous people from around the world. It also included legal experts and representatives from governments. So countries around the world, their officials had some say in what eventually ended up in that declaration. So there were a lot of different people involved in writing it. It took over 20 years, but they drafted this declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples. And what this declaration does is it sets out the minimum standard for Indigenous peoples' rights and the human rights of Indigenous peoples. And it says that all countries and governments in the world need to recognize that is the minimum standard for Indigenous peoples' rights. So this declaration was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2007. There were a few countries that voted against it, and that included Canada. Uh, that was in 2007, and then over about 10 years, Canada's positions shifted, and in 2016, Canada's federal government finally said, we endorse the UN declaration, and they committed to implement this declaration within Canadian law. So what are the standards for rights that are included in the declaration? It doesn't create new or better standards for international human rights. What it does is it looks at human rights that are already protected by international law, and it just clarifies that these rights also apply to Indigenous peoples. And that's important because there's a lot of existing human rights in international law and Canadian law that have been ignored when it comes to Indigenous peoples around the world. And so the declaration clearly says these are human rights that are universal. They also apply to Indigenous peoples. And the declaration gives governments, it gives countries some way to measure whether their laws and policies are meeting the international standard for the rights of Indigenous peoples. The declaration also specifically mentions Indigenous women, Indigenous children, and elders, and makes it clear that human rights and the rights in the declaration apply to them to make sure that they can't be discriminated against. And it also describes collective rights. So there's individual rights, which is the right one person has, and there's collective rights, which are the rights of the group. And a lot of the rights that Indigenous peoples have, like rights to land and rights to culture, those are collective rights. They're held by the community or the nation. They're not held by one individual people. So those are recognized in the declaration. So what are the actual rights in the Declaration? We can look at them kind of as being divided up into different categories. There's 46 articles in the Declaration. Each article is just a paragraph of maybe a few sentences that describes one right. But overall, all those different articles talking about rights can be divided into a few categories. And so the rights in the Declaration deal with equality, self-determination and self-government, security of the person, culture and language, education and media, free, prior, and informed consent. And that's, they use the acronym FPIC. People sometimes call it FPIC. Uh, there's also economic and social rights, health and wellness, lands and resources, and treaties and agreements. So how does the rights in the Declaration interact with Canadian law? The rights in the Declaration that talk about international human rights standards, those are part of international law because they're included in international treaties and agreements about human rights. And so they're part of Canadian law. Canada recognizes these international human rights standards and it's reflected in Canadian law. And this is things like prohibiting genocide, requiring governments not to discriminate against people, ensuring gender equality, workers' rights. These are some of the international human rights that the Declaration clarifies. These apply to Indigenous people. And that's important because there's a history of racist laws and legislation in Canada that does violate these rights. So the Indian Act and the really old style Indian Act laws around status Indians not being allowed to vote, that's a human rights violation. Status Indians not being able to leave the reserve without permission, that's a human rights violation. And we're still seeing some court cases where people say the Indian Act discriminates against Indigenous women on the basis of their gender. And so it's really important to clarify that these are international human rights that also apply to Indigenous people. There are other rights that are included in the Declaration about things like self-determination, language and culture, and lands and resources. And it's not 100% clear that they are part of existing Canadian law. Um, and part of that is that they're not clearly reflected as international law in existing international treaties and agreements. So there's room there to agree or disagree with the idea that they are part of Canadian law or policy. Um, but one thing we can keep an eye on is that international law about the rights of Indigenous people is changing over time. And so as that international law about the rights of Indigenous peoples changes, it could influence Canadian law. And there could be a really clear determination at some point in the future that these rights are part of Canadian law. So what is the law, the legislation on the UN Declaration right now? Canada has very recently, in June of 2021, passed legislation on this UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And they call that act the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. And this law, it does not directly implement that declaration. It doesn't make the declaration law. It doesn't make the rights in it law in Canada. What the legislation does is it requires Canada's federal government to review all of its laws, all federal legislation, and make sure all of that legislation is consistent with the UN Declaration. So it's a law that commits them to a very comprehensive review process of all their legislation to make sure it's consistent with the UN Declaration. But that does not apply to any provincial or territorial law. Canada has said we can do this for our laws, for federal legislation, but we can't tell provinces or territories what to do with their laws. That's their business. They need to deal with it. So this review process is only going to apply to federal legislation and it doesn't apply to GNWT. GNWT is involved in their own process to figure out how to implement the UN Declaration. And I know they are considering passing legislation about the UN Declaration, but that would be separate from this federal legislation. So how does the Declaration interact with modern treaties? And modern treaties is things like land claims and self-government agreements. The Declaration cannot take away from the rights that Indigenous people have negotiated in these treaties and agreements. And this is included in the Declaration itself at Article 37. It says that government has to respect and uphold and properly implement the treaties and agreements that they've negotiated with Indigenous peoples. So again, the Declaration is the minimum standard for rights of Indigenous peoples. Government can't take away rights below that, but there can be rights in addition to that that are negotiated. So government can't say Indigenous peoples have a treaty or agreement and the Declaration says they should get less, so they get less. That's not how it can work. If Indigenous peoples have an agreement and they like it and they want it to be enforced and implemented and government to follow it, then the Declaration itself says that that is what has to happen. So looking now at some of the categories of rights that are in the Declaration and what they mean. There are rights about equality and non-discrimination. So again, Indigenous peoples have the same human rights and freedoms as all other people in Canada and around the world. So that includes the right to be free from discrimination and to have human rights respected. And particularly when it comes to Indigenous identity. So the Declaration is really clear that government can't discriminate against Indigenous people because they are Indigenous.
On self-determination and self-government, UNDRIP ensures that that Indigenous peoples have the right to govern themselves and choose who they want their leaders to be, and to govern themselves in their own territory, and to organize their own government and resources to finance their own government. And I think that's very crucial on resources, is that, as we know, we live, Canada is mostly, is all of Indigenous lands, and we have abundance of resources. And so how we extract resources to finance and governments is very crucial. And that's how governments are run mostly. And as well as making sure that Indigenous peoples belong to a nation and to organize themselves politically, legally, economically, socially, and culturally, and how they choose to support their communities. And especially in the right to fully participate as peoples and citizens in the country that they live in. I think around the world that's very important, because we see a lot of Indigenous peoples getting displaced through political upheaval or through resource development. I think reservations and reserves are a good example of Indigenous people getting displaced from their traditional areas. And so the Declaration states that they need to belong to their own territory and decide for themselves how they want to govern themselves. Life, integrity, and security. Indigenous people have the right to be physically and mentally safe and free, and to not experience genocide or any other act of violence. I think Canada has experienced this, and we're still feeling the effects of residential school, where children were taken away from families and from denied their culture, language, and way of life. And we're still seeing that through the taking of children from homes into the into the foster care. Canada has the highest number of that happening right now. And so it's continuing today, and hopefully through policy and through the implementation on how UNDRIP in this area can address those things. But that's what life, integrity, and security really is about, is to make sure that we have the right to make sure our children aren't taken away. Cultural, religious, and linguistic identity. The Indigenous peoples should not be forced into assimilation or experience the destruction of the culture, the language, and who we are as a people, and especially customary laws. Indigenous peoples have been using customary laws. Adoption is a very good example, as well as in traditional knowledge and usage of lands and how land is used. Traditional knowledge is a huge one. And so those are the kind of rights Indigenous people should continue to practice and to use, as well as for outsiders to not use these type of information without free, prior, and informed consent. Education, public information, and media. This is a huge one because gaps exist in all of the systems within Canada. Education, health, housing, we all know that. An education system is a huge one. It calls for Indigenous peoples to provide education in their own languages, in their own culturally based ways. The K'asho are a very good example where the mission statement is strong like two people, is that the education system within the K'asho calls for languages, culture, and way of life to be infused into the education system so that the children and the students become strong like two people, to be able to live in both worlds. And so Indigenous children particularly should be able to access all levels of education without discrimination, and for the public education to reflect this as well. As right as media, Indigenous people should be able to express themselves in their own languages and culture, practice their culture in the media.
So free, prior, and informed consent, uh, sometimes called FPIC. It's a very important thing in the Declaration, and it's something that's talked about a lot. It's sometimes a very contentious issue. So this is not one right that's just in one part of the Declaration. It's an idea that's included in quite a few places in the Declaration. And what this is it's about the right of Indigenous peoples to participate in decision making about issues that will impact them and their lives, their communities, and their land. So what this free, prior, and informed consent is saying is that Indigenous people need to be able to participate in decision making, and they need to participate in a way that is free, in the sense that their opinion and their decision on it is not influenced by coercion or bullying. They're not pressured to make a decision one way or the other. It has to be a freely made decision. Their decision needs to be prior, in the sense that they're included in upfront in the planning of whatever's happening, that government doesn't come to them after the fact and say, oh, we're doing this, do you agree or not? It has to be a decision that's made before there's actually any action. And the decision of Indigenous peoples needs to be informed. So they need to have all the proper information, and they need to have it with enough time and resources that they can review the information and make a really good decision. They can't be forced to make a decision with limited or inadequate information, and they can't be forced to make a decision where they have 15,000 pages of paper to read and only 2 weeks to do it. The decision needs to be informed. They have to have all the proper information and the time and resources to go through it. And then based on that whole process, Indigenous peoples, they have to consent. So that means they're free to say yes or no to whatever this proposed action or activity is that might impact their lands and lives. And Indigenous people set out how this process to get their consent works. It has to be them saying, this is what free, prior, and informed consent is. This is how you deal with us. It can't be government saying, this is what free, prior, informed consent is. That's how we're going to deal with you. So Indigenous peoples determined how they give or withhold their consent to this thing. And so the Declaration says that free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples is required for all decisions, for all actions and activities that could have a really serious impact on the rights of Indigenous peoples. Their consent is absolutely required in those situations. There are some cases where the potential impact on Indigenous people's rights may not be really serious. And in those situations, it may be a case where the government is obligated to really try to get the consent of Indigenous people, to go through that whole process with them. But if Indigenous people withhold their consent, that may not prevent government from moving ahead if the rights infringement is not really serious. But if the rights infringement is really serious, government absolutely has to get the free, prior, and informed consent of the impacted Indigenous people before it can proceed.
On the economic and social rights, Indigenous people have the right to participate in economic activities. Um, Indigenous people should be able to develop how they want to develop their economic and social rights in whatever governance systems they have set up. Traditional based economy is very important and crucial to the survival of the economy of Indigenous peoples. We see that in a lot of ways through trapping, traditional arts and crafts. There are so many. When you travel the world and visit Indigenous peoples, like in Peru and places like that, you see the traditional economy being alive, and those are it's more than just that. And so to be able to improve their socioeconomic conditions through whatever social economic or through whatever economic activities they want to pursue, or whatever their traditional based economies is very crucial. And so Indigenous people have the right to participate in those things, as well as determine for themselves those things. It could also include education, employment, vocational training, retraining, housing, and so on and so forth. So it encompasses all the things that that Indigenous people need to do to develop themselves and their communities and their nation, so that they can participate in those economic activities. Lands, territories, and resources is crucial for survival as a people. Indigenous peoples have the right to live in their lands and traditional territories, to determine how they care and use those lands that they own. And so lands is very important to Indigenous people, as we all know. Um, the resources and the connection to the land and the place names and the traditional places that Indigenous families frequent, and all of the language and knowledge is weaved into the land. It's I think something that Indigenous peoples across the world understand. And so the spirituality and the connection and the knowledge and tradition and the systems that's infused in the land, those need to be respected. And Indigenous people have the right to all of that. And so these rights shouldn't be disrespected. And if it is, then government must work to fix this. And so when it comes to disposition of lands, whether through appropriation or force relocation, then those Indigenous people should be given back those lands or fairly compensated. Treaties, agreements, and other arrangements. There's a lot of treaties in various forms across Indigenous worlds. Canada is, there's a lot of different treaties that were made in Canada. There's historic treaties and modern treaties, and land-based management treaties, programs and support type of service delivery that they've agreed enter into. And Indigenous peoples, originally there was no borders, right? And so when Canada became a country in US and so on and so forth, there was these arbitrary borders that were created. And so Indigenous people should have the right to maintain relations across each other, across the borders. We see that with the Anishinaabes or the Mohawks and the Gwich'in You see a lot of Gwich'in in US and the Yukon. So they should be able to maintain those connections across the borders. And so government has to support that, as well as to have the treaties respected by the governments and the parties that that have entered into these treaties. And the implementation of these treaties is very crucial, and the enforcement and the respect those agreements. And again, implementation in my work is very crucial in how parties work together to make sure those agreements are respected and the spirit and intent is held in highest esteem. So the declaration doesn't take away from what's been negotiated in these treaties and these arrangements between the parties, indigenous governments and governments. And so when there's laws being introduced or passing of laws, then there's got to be some cooperation, consultation, and in some cases collaboration to these laws, government laws, legislations, as well as to implement the UN Declaration. How do you implement the UN Declaration? That's the big question. And so I think Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in consultation or cooperation, and I would go further and say they should collaborate on that. And so Indigenous peoples should get assistance and resources to implement this declaration, and as well as how it impacts, not impacts, but how it should be consistent with and harmonize existing treaties, agreements, and other arrangements. Why is UNDRIP important for the NWT? As we know, as I said earlier, all the lands that Indigenous people live in, the traditional territory of the Indigenous people is vast, and this is for all the Indigenous peoples around the world. And the NWT is no different. NWT exists on Indigenous lands and traditional territories. And the NWT has a majority Indigenous population right now. And the NWT is experiencing rapid, I wouldn't say rapid population, but the population of the Indigenous people is very young. And so the need is great to make sure that whatever happens in the north, it reflects the population as well. And we're seeing a lot of impacts from climate change, changes to the economy, especially recently through the pandemic. There's been a huge concern about reviving the economy. And there's also a lot of social and cultural changes, especially with a lot of our young people working at mines and other employment. And people are more mobile these days than before. And we do have a lot of issues in our communities, housing crisis and mental health and addictions, but we're experiencing a lot of rapid changes in our communities in the Northwest Territories. And so by implementing UNDRIP, it will help Indigenous nations protect and preserve who they are as a people, their language, their culture, the environment, the land, and for future generations to come. It's also an opportunity, I think, to create a unique environment where UNDRIP can truly, the declaration can truly affect what Indigenous people and government have been striving for generations, for many years, through negotiations and through the strive for recognition of who we are as a people and a government. A recognition, implementation that it would affect all Indigenous rights. So I think it's a unique opportunity in the Northwest Territories that through the intergovernmental relations that we've been able to create, that I think that the NWT would be in a unique position to fully implement what the declaration was meant to do. Ways that Indigenous governments are implementing the declaration. Some of the ways that it's been able to do some of the things that's been identified in the articles is that intellectual property rights to Indigenous knowledge is a huge one. I think up and down the valley, you could see that a lot of the Indigenous knowledge are taking shape and policies are being formed, whether through its work on the land or caribou monitoring programs like Boots on the Ground, or through health policy forums that's been created. And so I think the intellectual property rights to Indigenous knowledge is one of the areas that Indigenous governments are implementing the declaration. The free, prior, informed consent protocols and policies that Daniel has talked about, and I think through some of the legislation that they've had a thorough discussion on what that could be, as well as asserting guardians asserting and protecting land rights. Through some of the protected areas, they've created guardianships on how they would monitor what goes on the land, and for environmental management. I think those are very crucial. Caribou is a huge one. Caribou is the livelihood of many of the First Nations in the Northwest Territories, and so monitoring and using guardians to assert and protect those rights is one of the areas in which Indigenous governments are implementing the declaration. Protected areas, the establishment of the Indigenous protected areas is another one. There's one in the Satu area, and just recently in the K'suk, where these protected areas are being created. And so it's working with those Indigenous governments and governments in making sure that using the traditional knowledge and the role of guardians to monitor that Indigenous governments are implementing UNDRIP. So that concludes our presentation on the declaration, and we hope that you enjoyed it as much as we do. Merci.